Welcome back to everybody. This is part 3 of our series on assembling the FJ40 Landcruiser, the C34 KM. So today we're going to assemble the chassis. So we'll get to and get all the bits and pieces ready, and we'll show you the assembly of the chassis. As you can see, we've got the body pretty much finished. So now we're going to get started on the chassis. So I'll get the screws ready and then we'll get it started. As you can see on the instructions here, we have quite good detail. The chassis assembly, which starts off with the shock absorbers, and then it moves on to the chassis rails, installing the engine or the motor, axles, and then all the drive shafts and so forth. So let's get started and see what we can produce with this. So here we have the further breakdown of the axles and the installation, the final carry out of the chassis installation. So we'll get the bits and pieces together and see what we can get assembled. Well, the next part is actually assemble the motor into the gearbox. So we'll get those pieces together and we'll start assembling. So we start off as per the instructions with the shock absorbers. As you can see, I've done one here. Seems to be quite nice, quite firm, but let's see how they go. So they're very simple to assemble. We have the barrel. We slip the rod into the shock absorber, and then using a Phillips screwdriver, just hold the rod in place while we screw the eye onto the end of the rod. Just taking that up till the end of the thread, just nips up quite nicely. There we go, just nip it up a little bit, and now we drop our spring in and place our end cap onto these two tabs. So the end cap is quite a simple little device here, almost just like a clip really. Make sure you get them lined up with the two tabs there, and there we go. We've got that assembled. So you can see here the mounting screw goes on the side here, and then this will go onto the axle, I assume. So we'll follow the instructions and get on to the next bit. I see there. Well, I've gathered all the pieces together for the gearbox. We've got the motor, of course, the two parts of the gearbox casing, the primary and secondary gear, and the bearings. We've got 3 pieces of beautiful little ball bearings, 2 screws to mount the gearbox to the motor, and 2 for the casing, as well as a tube of grease. I've already put the little grub screws into the gears. So we have this one here is the cross shaft. So this one here is the driven gear, and then it drives one of the tail shafts, and this part goes onto the motor. So first up, we have to put the gearbox case, or the motor, into the gearbox case. So it fits in there quite nicely, and we line that up. 2 mounting holes, I'm not sure if you can see those there, and a couple of screws. So we'll get those in place. And again, the Phillips screwdriver. And we'll get the second one in there before we tighten that one up. So the instructions mount everything quite clearly and describe everything quite clearly. Easy to find the different components, so that's good. Get those quite firmly nipped up. So we don't want the motor coming apart while we're out on a trail somewhere. Motor falling off, coming loose. So they're both quite firmly in now. So the driven gear, or the driving gear, goes on here. can see. Let's put that grub screw in just a little too far. Yep. So now we'll get that tightened up nicely. Make sure that's quite firm, you don't want that chattering in there. So that's quite nice. Just give it a little nip up again. Okay. You don't want to get too carried away either, because I mean, being a brass gear, you don't really want to strip the threads out of there either. So that's our first gear in place. And our second gear, just do the grub screw up onto the shaft there before we go any further. So this shaft has two cutouts in it, or two flats in it. One's to take the drive shaft, and the other one is to lock this gear onto. And it's nice and firm. So then we have our bearings, slip onto the shaft nicely. We have one at each end of this cross shaft, and then we have one that goes onto the driven shaft. Okay, now we can see in the gearbox case here that everything lines up nicely, and we have a position in here for the two bearings to sit. So we can pop those in. We can see that one's blind, so that bearing goes in here, and then this one goes in here. Clip together on the casing there. Beautiful fit. So now we have our output shaft and our output shaft for our two tail shafts. So very easy to put together. I'm just going to take that apart quickly and put some grease in there, because we don't want to be running these sort of things dry. And we can see the bearings actually stayed inside the housing there, which is fine. So we'll get some grease on there. I think it's always wise when you run these sort of gearboxes, you give it a first run, and then after a period dismantle it and give it another dose of grease, because there's no point ending up with grease just all in the casing. You really need to end up with it on the teeth. So that looks pretty good there. And we'll get some on the other gear. Make sure that bearing hasn't come out of place. So it looks fine. So we'll get our teeth greased up a little here. A little more, don't need to be stingy. You can, of course, if you're down the track when you want to clean your gearbox out, the Vaseline actually works very well in these gearboxes also. Probably doesn't have quite the same lubricating properties, but it certainly works fine. Okay. We'll get the wriggle to get it in place here. Let's see what's going on. Bearings look okay, so no reason. There we go. So just a bit of misalignment. So I'll get these couple of screws in here. Two screws to go in here, and that locks up our gearbox. Okay, we'll move on to the next part. So now we're going to begin the chassis rails. So we have the ball joints that connect the suspension arms. They go in to these positions here, and the lock nut on the back. So I'll get those in. I'll cut the video for a minute, get those in place, and you can see how that looks. Okay, so just tighten up the last of these ball joints with the lock nut one side and just give it a good firm nip up, and perfect. So all the suspension ball joints are now in. So now we'll move on to the motor and gearbox mounting into the chassis, which also forms one of the cross members, of course. So we have two sides with the ball joints all facing inward. There we go. Okay, so that's our motor in position and ready for the next stage. So just holding it firmly, we can put the two screws either side. There's two on each side of the chassis. Get them nipped up. Okay, one more to go on the other side. And then we'll be ready to start with our cross members. So that gets everything firmly in place and the basis for our chassis. Okay, so now it comes time to fit up the shock absorbers. Put the 4 screws holding the chassis in place, so that should be quite rigid now. So the shockers, it does stipulate in the instructions to be careful not to over tighten them, and as you can see I've installed this one, it still allows it to flex with the axle movement, of course. So we use these flathead style screws here. Through and to the side of the shock absorber, into the spigot here on the side. So we'll follow their instructions and not do it too tight. Knit it up nicely, and as you can see we've still got good flex now. So next in line is to put the steering servo just slips into the housing like so, and then that goes between the chassis rails and forms the front cross member. You need to put the shock absorbers in first because the screws are obviously covered by the housing here. And then these are the front bumper bar mounts. They slip in here and are held in at the same time as the servo mounting and the servo tray and the. Just lift that up, and we can see there that our chassis come together nicely. So I've also popped one screw into the rear cross member here. Get another screw in there. These are also the large flange type. I'm not sure how easy that is to see on the camera there, but we'll just nip that up nice and neatly. I'll get the others. See, we've got the other screws to go in here, which I'll get to, and then we'll get on with the next part. Okay, so now I've got all the shock absorbers on. I'll put the rear ones on. Again, they move very freely. Rear cross members in here, and we've got all our ball knuckles in place for our suspension tie rods and our arms. Front shock absorbers, springs, and our bumper bar mounting brackets, and here's the front bar. It just sits in here firmly, quite nice. couple of screws on the bottom here, and next we have our cover for the servo. So it mounts here and keeps everything nicely enclosed. So that's basically the chassis all together. Waiting for the axles, of course. So we'll get the axles and start to assemble those. Firstly, we'll just have a quick look at our. We'll probably need to do some adjusting here on our servo for the steering. So we'll also get that loosely in place, ready for testing. Okay, well, on to the axles. So this is the front axle. So it comes shipped with the carrier screwed together, so it looks like it's one piece, but it actually comes apart. And we slip the main axle in. We've got 4 small bearings here and the crown wheel, and then of course we've got these half shafts that come out on either side, so we get those into place. And then the second half of the axle slips across like so, and then the pinion and the carrier is assembled like this. So you can see here on the rear axle that it looks like it's one piece, where it is in fact the ends come off. And if we undo these screws here, we'll see that the carrier frame comes away. This is the carrier frame here. And enables us to get the pinion and the bearings and so forth into place. I'll just get this apart so you can see it. And this also then holds the rear cover on later. Now I think we've got it. Okay, so there's the carrier frame where the pinion goes into, and the small bearings go into here and here, and then the pinion together with the shaft. So we'll just slip a bearing onto there and see how it fits in. You can see the bearings are tiny little bearings. Slip across the shaft like so. Drop this into the carrier frame, and there we have our pinion gear. And our second bearing of course goes on the outside. These bearings also fit inside one another very well, so they hide in the packaging quite well. There's our second bearing. I also found a nice way of, just because it's a slight press fit into there, so if we use one of these axle ends for the rear axle, and we will just press this on. It'll on properly. Just use our fingernails in to press him on, hopefully. Okay, so now we have our pinion gear properly mounted, so everything's ready to go on our carrier. So now all we have to do is open our axle up, and the same as what we've done on the front there, which I showed you. We can slip our axle in. So we got our axle split open here with the axle shaft. Our crown wheel will go in here, slipped onto the axle. Just need to undo the grub screw a tiny bit there. All these grub screws come separately also, so you have to install those when they're best to get them all in place first rather doing them one by one. Simply slides over there, locates on this flat here. Looks like I've put that on back to front, but you get the idea. So then it sits here and ready for our carrier and pinion gear to be installed. So I'll continue with that shortly, and I'll get these assembled and then we'll catch up to show you the final assembly. Okay, just a little bit more on this. So now I've put the axle in here. You can see the 4 bearings, crown wheel in position, and I've just put the carrier in there with half the axle assembled. So you can see how it rotates. It rotates very smoothly, it's very nice. So we'll just make sure that everything is nice and centralized. We'll lock up the grub screw holding the crown wheel in place, and then we'll get the top half of the axle in place and carrier, and screw it all back together again. We'll get back to you just before we put the cover and so forth on this, and put a bit of grease on it, and it'll be ready to go. So one last little reference to do, I think, before buttoning these axles up is just making sure that everything rotates perfectly and that all the grub screws are tightened up. As you can see here, all the grub screws are in line. Make sure that you haven't clamped on a flat piece of the, or part of the axle that doesn't have the flat machined into it. So for it to be correct, all the grub screws should be in line and they should all be nipped up quite snug. But obviously don't over tighten them, otherwise you'll strip the threads and break things. But so then we can slip the top half of the axles into place. So there's the rear axle, and make sure that it rotates nicely, and as you can see it does. So that's very good. And then we have the front axle, which we'll do the same with. Obviously it's a little bit different with the half shafts hanging off it, but it's a little bit firm. We probably need to just find out where that's binding up a little bit. Seems to be freeing up now. We'll have a little look where it might be rubbing or something. It's just a little bit of a flat spot there, a tight spot. Actually it's getting better every time. So just make sure that these work really freely before going any further. But now that you can see that's rotating perfectly. So it was probably just a very slight binding of something. So now we'll get the end covers on, we'll get the pinion carrier on, put some lubrication in them and get them buttoned up. As you'll see here, I've assembled up all these links so we can get them into the suspension. So we've got 8 of these short links. I actually used a screwdriver in each end to tighten those up a bit because it's actually quite strenuous on your fingers as you've done a few. I've also completed the front axle here, so with the 2 king pins in place also. The bushing, so everything operates quite smoothly there. They're a little bit rough running, so I'll run them for a little while and see how they go, and then after they've bedded in, open them up again and replace the grease. I'm not sure if everyone has the same trouble, but they're just a little bit lumpy as you rotate it. Rotates free enough, but a little bit lumpy as if the gears aren't quite meshed perfectly. So we get these carriers onto the axles now, and then we'll mount them up into the chassis. So next we'll be putting the carriers on, as I say. Okay, the carriers are now installed and all fastened down snugly. I've put one of the ball joints in with the link. So this one will go on the other side. They're quite firm in here actually, so they do take a fair bit of effort to screw in. And then on the top links, we have these long screws, and pressing the ends into the rod ends. You can see here how I did it. Just put them on the bench and just clip them on. Okay, so you end up with a nice knuckle end. So I've prepared these two, so we can get those on with the mounting screw through them. So we have to feed it through both of these, and then a nylock nut on the end of the screw, and that'll give us our 4.4 link suspension. So it's actually very nicely made, but it can be a little tricky to get it together. So there we have our two upper links and one lower link, and the other one I'll put in there, and this is where our shock absorber and suspension mounts to. So that's basically the axle completed. We have the steering knuckle to go on the steering arm to go on, but now we can really get them put together and then clipped into the chassis. So I'll get the rest of these screws put in, and then we'll put it into the chassis. These carriers sit on the top of the axle with the supports forward toward the pinion gear or toward the tail shaft, and then these longer screws go through the whole assembly. They're quite snug through here, which is good. So now that goes through the spigot in the axle. See the screw protruding through the bottom here, and then we have these keepers which go into the base here, and that is what we tighten up to. So we get that nice and straight. Swings around, and then for the second bolts. So I'll get that done on both axles and get those buttoned up. Okay, the carriers are now installed and all fastened down snugly. I'll put one of the ball joints in with the link, so this one will go on the other side. They're quite firm in here actually, so they do take a fair bit of effort to screw in. And then on the top, on the top links, we have these long screws, and pressing the ends into the rod ends. You can see here how I did it. Just put them on the bench and just clip them on. Okay, so you end up with a nice knuckle end. So I've prepared these two, so we can get those on with the mounting screw through them. So we have to feed it through both of these, and then a nylock nut on the end of the screw, and that'll give us our 4.4 link suspension. So it's actually very nicely made, but it can be a little tricky to get it together. So there we have our two upper links and one lower link, and the other one I'll put in there, and this is where our shock absorber and suspension mounts to. So that's basically the axle completed. We have the steering knuckle to go on the steering arm to go on, but now we can really get them put together and then clipped into the chassis. So I'll get the rest of these screws put in, and then we'll put it into the chassis. So with the axle now, with all the arms mounted, we'll get that into the chassis and see how it all looks. We'll start off with the top links, just clip those into position. And the bottom link. The top one here. Get tight next to the motor, of course, but just enough space there. Ooh, wrong link there. Flip that off again. This time we'll try and put it onto the correct one. Go. And the last one there. Okay. And now we have our 4-link suspension all in place. And we can clip our shock absorbers on. Okay. And just one more on the other side. Okay. So there we have it. Axle completely installed. Suspension working. Very nice little installation actually. So we'll catch up with you on the next one, where we'll get the body mounted up to the chassis. We'll get the electrics in it, and we'll get it running, and we'll put all the trimmings on and so forth. Get the mirrors and so forth onto the body. Get the headlights in place. And get it all buttoned up, and then we'll take it out for a test drive. So we'll see you next time. Thank you very much for watching, and please give us a like and a subscribe. See you soon.